Hello, I'm Daniel Friebe. I'm here with Lionel Birnie and in the guise of Richard Moore's body double, Ned Boulting. Hello, Ned.
Hello, it's very nice to be here.
Lionel.
Hello, Daniel.
The Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Interviews and analysis, we've got the big talking points covered.
Where are we?
We're in our home venue, the National Theatre on the South Bank. Very quiet morning here.
1st of December. Happy Advent.
Yeah, you're doing a little Twitter Advent calendar, Ned.
We should perhaps happy end of Movember, most importantly.
Yeah, I'm over that. You're still flying the... Yeah.
It's Beardzember. Beardzember. I'm not doing Movember. It's just laziness, pure laziness. But Ned's, if you follow Ned Boulting on Twitter, as I imagine everybody out there does, you're doing an Advent calendar, a photo a day, cycling-themed photo of the day. December the 1st, Hoogerland. I mean, X-rated picture of Johnny Hoogerland from the Tour de France. It
is horrible, isn't it? I'd forgotten quite how gruesome it is. And I think what makes it awful, more awful than I'd remembered, is the fact that his racing shorts have been ripped so far open that you can see not only his left buttock but his right buttock and everything in between virtually. But it'd be nice if people joined in. It's a fun thing to look at in your commute. Epic. It's got to be epic cycling photos.
Hashtag epic.
So, chaps, what are we going to talk about? I think the big issues of last week or so has probably been the announcement of the Velon, what would we call it, conglomerate association cabal. We've got Bolto in. He is the voice of, kind of almost the voice of cycling in this country now. That's it. We issued a come and get me plea, knowing that we were going to talk about this. And Ned, you responded favourably, and here you are to talk about Velon, its implications, what it's going to mean for cycling on TV, what it's going to mean for the sport, revenue sharing, all these buzzwords we keep hearing now. And then in the second part, I think we're going to go on to talk about Astana. There have been more positive doping cases for the Astana Continental team. Alexander Vinokurov, who is not a friend of the podcast, but who knows, he might be listening. He might be very keen for us to make that distinction, so we will make it. And the third part of the podcast, Ned, you're going to tell us about your recent travels in Africa, and it's going to kind of be the usual ad hoc, any other business affair. But
we've also got Paul Scoins, who's very much a friend of the podcast, occasional editor of the podcast. He was at the World Cup cyclo-cross in Milton Keynes at the weekend, and he has recorded a dispatch from there, so we'll hear that a bit later on as well.
Anyway, Velon, chaps, the announcement was made, well, it was kind of took us all by surprise. We knew that things had been sort of bubbling under behind the scenes. There'd been lots of meetings between this the teams making up this so-called Project Avignon group. They came out last week, and the timing of it seemed slightly strange. And the way I interpreted it was that they'd simply got to a point where they'd struck enough deals to feel as though basically there was something to say, and they were all more or less on the same page with it. The implications as far as next season are concerned seem to be a little bit blurry at the moment, certainly, and that's what the French team managers thought, that it was all a little bit vague at the moment. What did you make of it, Ned?
A little bit vague. You're being polite. I rushed. I was caught slightly on the hop. I was doing a book event in Hertfordshire that night, and I'd been out of kind of email and internet access all day, and somebody in the audience put their hands up and said, "What do you think about this Velon project?" And it was the first I'd heard of it, and so I had no idea. So late, sort of fudged an answer, and then later on that night, I rushed to the laptop and tried to click through to their website. Have you looked at their website? I mean, vague doesn't do it justice. I had no idea at that point what on earth they were talking about, and the only sort of hook that they seemed to manage to put on it was the use of bike cams, in-bike camera footage or whatever. But I guess what they're really on about is they want a share of television revenue, a la football model, so that the clubs in football benefit massively from the massive money that comes, the broadcasters strike a deal with the Premier League or the Champions League, and that gets divvied out across the clubs. And this is the model they want to replicate in cycling. I have my doubts whether the pot of money will be even remotely adequate, even if the people in charge of the keys of the pot of the money are willing to share that out, which I very much doubt, I just don't see what they really stand to benefit from this.
And just to be clear, I mean, based on what they've said, but also what we know, they want this money, they want to share this revenue, primarily not to get rich, or certainly in most cases not to get rich, but to make cycling more sustainable, give it a more sustainable economic model, so they're not in a position of having to look for sponsors every year, 2 years, 3 years. And, you know, in numerous cases, I think team managers, particularly Bjarne Riis is one of them, there are several others who have found themselves repeatedly in this position and have been sort of confronted with their own inadequacies as far as, you know, actually drumming up sponsorship is concerned. I think they find it very difficult, and they're aware that they don't want this to continue. They don't want to be in this position again and again and again.
Well, in that case, you know, they should be in badminton. I mean, searching for a sponsor has been part of cycling for a century, hasn't it? I mean, every year. It must be incredibly wearing, and they have my enormous sympathies, but that's their job. I mean, that is their job, and if they can't find a sponsor who's prepared to pay X millions of pounds every year, they'll have to find a sponsor who's going to pay Y millions of pounds a year. The danger is that if they really expect the Tour de France, which is what the race we're talking about, the only race that generates substantial income, to give up half of their revenue, which I think you suggest it probably is these days, that comes from television, and share it out amongst these teams, then you've reduced the Tour de France's income by 50%, essentially. The Tour de France props up Paris-Nice, the Dauphiné, the Criterium International, Liège-Bastogne-Liège, all loss-making races, I would suspect. The implications for the racing calendar, what do they want? No races? How's that going to work? So, I mean, I think it's just arse about tit, frankly. I think that if the money isn't there, they can't find the sponsors to pay the kind of salaries in cycling and operate in the way that then they're going to have to cut their cloth accordingly. They're going to have to reduce the number of riders, pay less to their riders, and you know that's the way to do it. But you can't start smashing holes in the calendar.
It all starts to sound slightly ridiculous when teams are going around with a begging bowl. When, you know, we hear that Peter Sagan, for instance, is being paid €4 million next year, and, you know, I've spoken to various riders this winter who have talked about how that has just skewed the market completely. And as you say, Ned, they obviously can't afford that. And Jonathan Vaughters did an interview with Peloton magazine this week in which he said that the sort of going rate now for the big teams is about $40 million a year. Why is it $40 million? It's because they're kowtowing to the demands of agents who, you know, are demanding salaries like €4 million for people like Peter Sagan.
Well, here was me thinking I was going to have to be the Eeyore-ish voice of doom, but you've actually started on a very pragmatic, almost overly realistic note. I should just clarify, we all love cycling, we love watching cycling. I think the elephants in the room, so to speak, are that the season is too long, there are too many professional riders, too many teams. You know, the whole thing has kind of ballooned out to cope with a need that has been created really by the teams themselves and the race organisers. And do we really think that a sustainable season starts with the Tour Down Under in January and goes all the way through to mid-October and has overlapping events? I mean, one of the big problems is that World Tour events happening at the same time, and we've talked about this before on the podcast about how the season is the way it is for numerous historical reasons, but also for practical reasons, that riders need events to get ready for the Tour de France or the Giro. They need preparation events to get race fit. Those events, the issue is that each of those events all want to be part of the conversation. They all want to be part of the landscape. The Tour of Romandy is on television, for example. I mean, does it really, from a sporting point of view, is that a race that people really want to sit down for a week and watch? It's interesting to me. I will watch it, but, you know, I work at home. I can have the TV on. It's not punching a hole in the sporting landscape in the same way that the Tour de France or the Giro will. And so we've got this situation where now they're trying to effectively monetize and stabilize to me a calendar that can neither be monetized or stabilized. That's the big problem. And I think the realistic thing is to say, and this is one of the things, the big problem with Velon is, and we touched on other sports, when the Premier League was founded in the early 90s, all 22 or 20 teams all sat down, their chairman all were part of the conversation. Velon is starting from a position of having perhaps just over half the teams involved and some notable teams outside of that. The French, Movistar, not part of the conversation. And so
Where's the collective bargaining? Where's the unity? Where's the strength of purpose?
Exactly. And then at the same time that Velon's announcement comes out, the race organisers are meeting with Brian Cookson in Oudenaarde to talk about how the calendar should look in future, and the teams aren't part of that conversation. So there's so much work to do to bring everybody together, and just concentrating on the buzzwords of fan engagement, stability, money. We're so far away from that at the moment. What really needs to happen is for somebody to decide and make some unpopular decisions without it degenerating into a kind of cat fight. Because as soon as you put the idea on the table that, say, the Vuelta should be 2 weeks, the Spanish are up in arms about that. As soon as you say, well, Paris-Nice perhaps ought to go away, then ASO feel like they're being chipped away at, and they would just, perfectly reasonably say, well, we've propped that race up for a decade, why are we now suddenly killing it, or whatever the proposals might be. The situation is that, as Ned says, the cake is not quite there yet, and I think one of the things that Serge Arsenault of the Quebec and Montreal races said about revenue sharing of TV rights. Television coverage for the Grand Prix Cycliste de Quebec and Montreal cost 1.6 million Canadian dollars, while my TV rights income is only 80,000 Canadian dollars. Do the teams want to split the bill? I'd be very happy to do that. And that, to me, seems the fundamental problem. There you have two very telegenic races in emerging markets currently not making money.
And, Lionel, you mentioned football there, but football teams, particularly in the United Kingdom and in Europe in general, have been lambasted in recent years for overpaying their players, for paying sort of 60-70% of their income has been spent on player wages, and they've been told that in no other kind of business is this sustainable. In cycling, I remember writing a feature a couple of years ago for Pro Cycling, talking about the difference between what Sky was spending, for instance, on research and development, and other teams, but generally asking team managers what percentage of their budget, their sponsorship money, they were paying to riders, and it was generally about 80%, 70%, which, like I say, in no other kind of business is sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, it is worth pointing out that, I think that we were talking about this earlier, that cycling fans, probably for good reasons, tend to, I think, get a little bit ahead of themselves, especially in this country where we're seeing this kind of exponential growth in interest. Cycling is, in the sporting landscape, pretty small beer still. It's punched its way up from being, almost off the radar to somewhere, and it's in that kind of like broad second tier of sports that come and go throughout the season in terms of their popularity, a bit like tennis and athletics. It's kind of there, but it isn't. The viewing figures are excellent on ITV, but they're not eye-watering. They're nothing compared to a big football match. Absolutely nothing. And the second highest rated race on British television, bike race, is the Tour of Britain by some distance. It's actually quite close to the Tour de France on occasions, the number of people who want to watch it. Now, I don't know exactly where we're at with that at the moment, but certainly in 2008, and for a good 4 or 5 years after that, when the Tour of Britain first struck a deal with ITV, it was being delivered to ITV for free. So ITV were not paying a thing for it. They were putting it out, in a sense. They were filling their schedules, which is what they own, with a risk, because they didn't know how many people would watch it. And I think now there may be a small amount of money that ITV contribute to, in terms of rights, but it's pretty marginal. And
well, isn't one of the problems the cost of actually broadcasting cycling? I mean, a friend of mine's a producer, and just on the Tour of Britain, you see it on social media, perhaps people criticising, why didn't you have a camera on this happening? Well, there's only a certain number of cameras, there's only one helicopter. I mean, even the Tour de France can't offer this kind of broad, all-seeing eye coverage, and I think that's one of the temptations of the Velon movement. I mean, somebody, I can't remember who it was, but somebody did say that the Velon proposals are basically the same old proposals, but just with GoPro footage from inside the bunch. While that would add another dimension to the coverage, is that really what is going to drive interest? Once you've seen a couple of bunch sprints, you might see some good incidents. Is that going to change the dynamics of cycling on television sufficiently to suddenly unlock the door to an Aladdin's cave of riches? I'm not entirely sure. I think that the stability argument is probably the most important, to create a cohesive calendar But then I always will worry about the way they want to sort of crown one rider the greatest rider of the year, and I think it's like comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah,
You can't compare Tony Martin and Alberto Contador.
Well, chaps, we've heard very passionate arguments for why Velon is a load of old border dash, but you can see the point of view, however, of the teams in the sense that they are providing entertainment. They see themselves as being the providers of entertainment, and they ought to be remunerated for it.
Well, yes, I can, but they are
being. The sponsors are their source of income. 'Twas ever thus. I don't understand why they now sort of feel that they have a right to the races, the stage on which they perform. It's like the Rolling Stones playing at Wembley Stadium and saying, "Can we have a share of Wembley?" No, you've got the ticket. That's.
Again, to talk about football, Ned, if we all know about the big chunk of money that teams get from competing in the Champions League, the Premier League, revenue agreement, whereby teams not even playing in the Premier League benefit from that. There's parachute payments when teams get relegated; they're still benefiting.
Turnstiles, tickets. Yeah. Where's that? Where does that exist in cycling?
Pay TV as well.
It doesn't exist. It's not there.
Yeah, I think that's the big point there is that all of these sports that have unlocked riches have existed on a pay TV model. In the UK, it's changing very slowly, but for 20 years, if you wanted to watch a top Premier League fixture live on television, you had to either pay 30 odd quid a month to Murdoch for Sky or go to a pub. Now, cycling is nowhere, not even in the core nations, is it anywhere close to having pay-per-view. Are you going to... Is a Frenchman or an Italian or a Spaniard going to fork out to watch the Alpe d'Huez stage of the Tour de France on television? Or are they going to watch it... They expect, culturally, historically, for that to be on free-to-air television.
It's a bit like the cycling podcast, isn't it? Can people reasonably be expected to fork out for the cycling podcast? We haven't reached that point yet.
We certainly haven't. We really ought to have a Just Giving page, or register as a charity or something. It seems to work for others.
But I think that ASO, to give them their due, certainly the way they operate in this market, are very conscious of the need to be free to air. Certainly for their blue ribbon events, obviously the Tour, but then they kind of chuck in a bit of a buy one get one free situation, which is why the Vuelta ends up free to air, at least in highlights terms. That needs to be broadened out. I think they're very conscious of the minute you close yourself behind a paywall, especially in a growing market, is the minute you cut off the oxygen of growth, and that's not a future, that's not a long-term plan, is it? And the Giro d'Italia, I think, who are marketed by the big conglomerate IMG, multinational, have very, very unrealistic expectations, at least in this market, of what their race is worth, and they need to drop the asking price, and that's the way you grow interest in the event. Let's finish as we started, in a way. The sums don't add up. So best case scenario, ASO agree. They say, yeah, Velon, you've got a great point here. We're just going to give you half our money. We're going to, because we just feel like we've woken up on the right side of bed. So that's a great idea. Here's a cheque for $700,000. Stick that into your 40 million, budget every year and see how far that goes. It's not enough.
This is the Telegraph Cycling Podcast with Richard Moore, Lionel Birnie and Daniel Friebe.
Hot on the heels of my trip to the Ghent 6 day last week. You can listen to that in last week's podcast, our Ghent 6 special. Also cycled down to the Tour of Flanders Museum in Oudenaarde. One of our editors, Paul Scoins, went to the cyclo-cross at Milton Keynes at the weekend, and here is his dispatch from there.
Well, it could be Belgium, it could be the Netherlands, but in fact it is Milton Keynes, right in the heart of the new town built in the 1960s. This is Campbell Park, named after Lord Jock Campbell, who was the man in charge of the development of Milton Keynes back then. Back in the 1960s, it was decided that Milton Keynes would have a dedicated cycling network. It has become one of the most cycling-friendly towns in the country. And it is here that the UCI have brought the World Cup series of cyclo-cross, and you can see why. It's a dedicated parkland, and they have torn a really technical course all the way through it, up hills, through some really muddy areas. There's steps, and there's a sort of a natural amphitheatre which is now forming part of the course. There's a men's and women's elite race today. We've got the national championships tomorrow. And there are thousands of people here. I have to say I'm from Milton Keynes, and I used to come here sledging in the winter, and it is about as slippery now as it was then. There is as much mud off the course as there is on the course at the moment, but no one seems to mind too much, and everyone seems to be really enjoying the racing.
almost looks like we're on the continent rather in Britain. It's hard to believe that.
I know, with all the cowbells and the sort of smell of rich Belgian ale and so on.
It was fantastic. It's fantastic. Obviously, the tour went to Yorkshire this year. We've got this here now at Milton Keynes. To see this many people out today is amazing.
It's quite encouraging, isn't it? When people have seen the tour, they've seen the road side of things, and people might just get into mountain biking themselves. But actually, this is a sport which combines all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you'll find me and Dean out there anytime soon. I mean, the skill these guys have is amazing, isn't it? I have no idea. We're just watching them on the big screens. Their back wheels sliding out for like tens of metres at a time and then holding on. Or if they fall off, get straight back up.
But then if you look at the success of people like Lars Boom in the Tour, there are skills which translate, aren't there?
Yeah, I think it's just an amazing base to have, isn't it? To have all those maximal efforts in your legs, and suddenly to go along a peloton must seem relatively easy. I don't know. And anyway, they go to something like Roubaix, and they think whatever. I don't care. I've seen all this before.
What do you think of today's event?
It's brilliant.
Yeah, it's good.
Have you ever been to anything like this before?
Not cyclo-cross. Really good. It's quite busy and muddy.
I know, it looks quite sort of difficult, doesn't it?
It does look difficult, and I've got a lot of admiration for the riders doing it, because we can hardly stand up in the mud ourselves, and we haven't got bikes.
I'm Rudy de Bie. I'm a coach from the national team cyclo-cross in Belgium. Yeah, it's a great sport to see. It's every race happening something. There's spectacular. It's not too long. For media, it's good. It's a good event, sport event.
Do you think that? I mean, it's one of those events that just seems to capture all elements of cycling. It's the road bit. You've got the sort of mountain bike element as well. There's the technical sort of changes as well.
It's very complete. They're really athletes that are complete. It's not the same like the road, because in the road most of the time, just the legs are doing it. Here is everything is used: the arms, the back, the shoulders, everything. You have to like running. It's complete. It's very complete.
Now, just looking at the standings at the moment, you've got Ellen van Looy, who's just in the lead at the moment for the women, and in the men's standings, you've got 4 in the top 5. You've had a good World Cup so far, haven't you, really?
Yeah, for sure. They're working so hard, so many years, so hard to stand where they are now. So a new generation is coming up, and it's still growing. It's getting so popular in Belgium.
What do you think about this race coming over to the UK? What does that say?
This is a great event. This is an example for many organisers. I can't say that there's anything wrong on this. This is very complete. It's a nice course.
What is it about it? Because you obviously got a good hill there. The course is a bit muddy as well, but then that's what you expect.
Yeah, it's muddy, but not too. The soil is perfect for the cyclo-cross. It's spectacular, and you need that. You need some spectacle. You need some uphill, some downhill. Yeah, it's a very, very complete course. This is a race, a course for the World Championship.
Payment first, the Americans got the Belgian, and now it's got to be out of the saddle as soon as she can. It is Compton as the payment. Here comes Sonny Khan. Sonny Khan out of the saddle, throwing the elbows, everything she can throw at it. She is throwing at it. It's going to go to the line. It's all. Sonny Khan has won the Milton Keynes World Cup of the humanity. She comes back from the canvas to score the win over Compton. Of the UCI Cyclo-cross World Cup in Milton Keynes, riding out of Belgium, Sonny Khan.
I had the white lines. Maybe I'm a little bit older now, so I'm a little bit stronger, I think. Can win also now on this parcours. So.
What did you think of the English crowds?
They are really amazing. It's like a world championship in Belgium.
Really?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Everybody cheers for everybody, so it's really amazing.
My name is Sarah Connolly, and I have a women's cycling podcast at prowomenscycling.com. I think it was one of the most exciting races. This season has been fantastic for the duels, but that Katie Compton versus Sanne Cant right up to the line. I mean, you can't really get a better World Cup than that, can you? Sanne's still a very young rider. She's Belgian, and while the Belgian men dominate men's cyclo-cross, in the women's side it's much more international. So the great Dutch riders like Marianne Vos, of course, and Daphne van den Brand have been really dominating it. The British riders, Nikki Harris, Helen Wyman, Gabby Darin, we're a real force here. But Sanne has just always been a star. She's always been the best sand rider in the world. But this year, she's just taken this step up. And now in this massively heavy, muddy, disgusting, claggy race, she's just having one of those years.
Well, the men's race underway, and it's hard to see past some of the Belgian riders who dominate the standings in the World Cup at the moment. 4 of the top 5 are from Belgium. Kevin Powell's leading at the moment, although at the moment it's Francis Moury from France. He's from the FDJ team, and he's the French national champion. He's leading at the moment, but all of the commentators, extremely excited commentators, are talking about Sven Nys, the world champion from last year, who has dominated cyclocross in the last 10 years or so. He's been world champion twice and has finished either bronze or silver in nearly every other year other than the ones he won. So extremely powerful force, regarded by lots of riders as the greatest in recent years anyway. We're doing a piece about the cyclocross today, and I saw that you guys are all from Sven's supporters club. Yeah. Does this compare to what you get over there?
About the crowd, yeah, it's about, you can compare it with Belgium, yes.
That's fantastic. So what do you think of Sven's sort of performance today? There's a couple of laps left.
Yeah, he had a little bit of bad luck in the beginning with his chain, and today was a test.
Why is he so loved in Belgium?
He's a training animal. He lives for his sports 100%, 200%. The other cyclists also, but he is another dimension. He does everything for his sport. And Sven is popular in Belgium. Why? Because he won some races on heroic ways. Like today, he was fairly last position. He comes back now. He's 8th. If the race must last 2 laps, he is in front.
So he just never gives up?
He never gives up, no.
And where have you come from? Where have you travelled from today?
From hometown, from Sven.
From Sven's town?
Yeah. In Baal.
In Baal?
Baal,
the cannibal from Baal. Okay, I know his nickname. That's brilliant.
Tomorrow we go to the cyclocross in Belgium, the Hammersogger.
And what do you love about cyclocross? What is it?
The atmosphere.
It's just the atmosphere. Enjoy the race.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, the race has passed the hour mark, and that is how long the men's elite race takes. The women's was 40 minutes, but the men ride for an hour, and then they work out the number of laps after the first 2. So I'm right by the finish line. The riders now just coming up the steps at the last minute. I think we've got another 20 seconds or so before the race finishes. That's it, that's the result. Kevin Powers, the Belgian, followed by Klaus van der Noord and Francis Moury in 3rd. But Kevin Powers, who was leading the World Cup Championship at the beginning of this morning, extends his lead. Sven Nys eventually finishing 8th, just a minute down from the leader.
Mooie wedstrijd. Dus schoon parcours en er was ook veel volk, dus dat is altijd wel zo.
He liked the race, thought it was a nice track.
Well, I've just been told that Kevin Powers speaks literally no English at all, so I will wish him well. But Klaus van der Noord, who came 2nd in this race and did well in the other 2 World Cup races, does speak excellent English, I'm told. So I'm going to grab a quick word with him.
Yeah, it's the first time that I come to here in the UK. It was a very nice track. The organisation was very good. And the atmosphere was also great. It was a little bit like in the USA. It was a special atmosphere, and I like it. It was the first time, and I hope I can come back next year.
Today's race quite close at the end. And how was the kind of race overall for you? Because it was slippy.
Yeah, everything was in it in the race and in the track. It was a real cyclo-cross with the mud, with the technical zones, with the running ups, and on the last lap is always important. I was taking the leading position, and I know if they make a mistake after me, I was the winner. But Kevin was also strong. We are with two strong guys in the same team. And it was very excited and nice last lap.
And how does it feel after 1 hour racing? You guys
tired, and tomorrow it's also a new race in Belgium. Now I gonna wash me.
Thank you.
Hi.
Well, we've just had the final press conference. I think they're all off to Belgium to go racing tomorrow. Simon Birnie, who's the race organiser, and Peter van den Abela from the UCI's off-road team are here. Simon, congratulations, a great course.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we wanted to make it a hard course and a hard race, and it turned out to be, with the weather that we had last week, even harder than we expected. But it actually still produced very exciting racing. So I was really happy to see two races that were so close and exciting.
I mean, the women's race was right down to the end, only a second in it, wasn't it? And the men's very similar too. I mean, right. You've got to be pleased that the course generated that kind of intensity.
Yeah, and I'm really surprised actually. I didn't think a course that hard would end in a sprint finish. So especially in the women's race. So that's it was great. It's really good.
And Peter, for the success of the sport, great crowds as well.
Yeah, exactly. Superb crowd, very good atmosphere. So, this venue had everything, so it had a good crowd, super course. For the UCI, it's very important to go, to leave the mainland Europe, because it was a historical race, so that is one. And once we had the opportunity, a very supportive council, and then this combined with the experience from Simon as the race organizer, this is a real success, and this was a plan and a mission for us to say, okay, this could be a good way to try, and if you see, it was not a tryout, it was just a perfect result. Huh?
Oh, gosh. Well, that squelching testifies the state of the grass here at Campbell Park. The number of people who came to this event today, I would say in the thousands. It looked quite incredible out on the hill. You couldn't see anything but for people, so that was a great result. And as the organiser said there, it certainly feels like it's been a success, and that this may not be the last we've seen on cyclo-cross on this scale in the UK.
You're listening to the Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Tweet us at cycling_podcast.
So, Daniel, another positive test for the Astana team, another positive test for the Continental team. Sorry, the distinction, that's the key point here. Explain what's going on.
And, were you aware, just first of all, that there is actually, I thought this was a joke when someone wrote this on Twitter the other day, but there is a team registered at continental level called Vino Forever, another Kazakh team. Did you know that, Boulting?
I had no idea.
With the great man's image on their turquoise jersey.
Really? Yeah. Now that's a bit of merchandising.
So, fifth positive test of as Vino was at pains to point out, the Astana umbrella organisation. He was keen to stress that it is a different team. The Continental team, like a lot of sort of satellite teams or under 23 teams affiliated with World Tour teams and major teams, has its own registration, its own roster of riders, its own staff. I looked at the website of the Astana Continental team. There was no head doctor listed. There was lots of speculation about whether the Belgian doctor Justin Marsner, who worked for CSC, was also the doctor of the Astana Continental team. That doesn't seem to be clear, but from Vinokurov himself there's been not much said, and never really much said from Vinokurov. There were quotes in the Gazzetta dello Sport saying that he would now suspend the Astana Continental team, which kind of begs the question, if they have nothing to do with the Astana Continental squad, then how on earth would he suspend their activities. However, he then, or certainly Astana's press spokesman, then suggested that he'd been misquoted. But it's all a big old mess, isn't it? And meanwhile, the UCI continue to investigate, and we are going to hear this week, I think, what the decision is from the UCI, whether their World Tour licence is going to be suspended. I suggest that it would probably not be suspended, but there may be some kind of disciplinary action. Bolto, your view?
I think the most charitable spin you can put on it at the moment is that because I think I'm right in saying all the 5 riders who've tested positive have been Kazakh nationals, that, and this is a charitable spin, is that Kazakhstan has a doping problem, and to give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe the World Tour team of Astana, seen as a whole, isn't an institutional doping outfit, but Kazakhstan possibly is. But that is a charitable view, and I think they've got a big issue here, and I think that Vinokurov deserves right now all the criticism and the approbation? Is that a word? Opprobrium, thank you. That comes his way.
I was thinking about this, Bolter. Is opprobrium the right word? Because the war on doping is fought on several fronts, and one of the fronts on which it has been fought is a moral front. We say that cheating is wrong, and that is the main reason why you shouldn't do it. In Vinokurov's case, this is a point that Christophe Basson's made at length. I remember when Vinokurov tested positive for blood doping in 2007. Can you condemn someone morally when, in Vinokurov's mind, his doping has given him fame, it's given him wealth, it's given his family security? On that moral level, he can fully justify that. When he looks at what he's become, what he's come from, and what he's become, what his family has become.
Yeah, that's not really what I meant. Actually, I wasn't really talking about his career as an athlete. I was talking about his current role as the head essentially of Astana. Because I remember during the Nibali Tour last year, we actually halfway through the race, when it was clear that Nibali was going to win it, I think Matt Rendell actually did the interview. He went and found Alexander Vinokurov, and he suggested to him, he asked that question that we all ask: what assurances can you give us that what we're seeing is fair and true and clean? And now, normally the Vinokurov reaction, I would have expected, would have been, I don't want to talk about this. This is something I don't want to talk about, which is his kind of default position. But actually, he decided on that occasion to go on the front foot, and he not only did he absolutely defend Astana's record, said root and branch, we are doing everything we can. We're part of the movement for cleaner cycling, whatever it's called. What's it called? The MPPV, Credible Cycling. We've signed up to that, unlike a lot of other teams. And he kind of put away, Sky in particular. He went on the offensive about their record. And so he wasn't backward in coming forward about suggesting that he is doing everything he can to run a clean outfit. Cobblers, isn't it? It's just rubbish.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the substances that, well, for instance, the Iglinski brothers have tested positive for EPO, but the 3 riders at the Continental team have tested positive for various forms of steroids. Personally, I think it's unlikely, that there's any kind of systematic doping apparatus program involved. And certainly, to give Vinokurov some credit or in fairness, I would say that the way these teams are set up, they are probably very separate. The Continental team, for instance, has its training camp in Ecuador of all places this year. So I would say that it's very unlikely that there's an umbrella doping program across those 2 teams. However, I would say there is probably a lack of vigilance at the very least.
That was my point. I wasn't suggesting, like I said initially, it's not. I don't think there is a systematic doping program in Astana. I think Kazakhstan has a problem. Yeah. But for him the disingenuous part comes when he says he's being proactive about creating a clean culture. That I don't buy, And for him to actually, point the finger at teams that I think are going about it in a slightly more honest way than his outfit, I think it's bad form.
And to go back to what I was saying about morality, I think he, even if he was delivering that message that it is wrong, he delivers that message from a position of no real credibility as far as his riders are concerned. Is his young Kazakh rider is not going to look at Vinokurov and say, actually, this guy's speaking with real conviction, because Vinokurov is still a millionaire. He's still living in Monaco, and he, and much like we've said about Lance Armstrong before, I don't think deep down he really believes that what he did was morally wrong, because he knows that everyone else was doing it. He knows, like I say, his family benefited from it, etc. So really, that is the wrong front to fight that war on. The only way, I think, to solve this problem is to remove Vinokurov from the situation, really, and punish him on that level, that sort of destroy the castle that he's built on his kind of doping past.
Yeah, I find the problem is it's wearying, because these all of these problems coming up now in 2014, if we'd taken slightly different, not even radically different approaches in 2004, 5, 6, or rather 5, 6, 7, when suddenly there was a rash of there was the Operation Puerto situation. There was Bjarne Riis confessed and is now running a team. Vinokurov is running a team. Nothing was put in place then to change the course of the sport. Basically, they didn't say, okay, there's now a 3 strikes and you're out rule. There's a fit and proper person test for management. Dopers are allowed to run teams. We're stuck with that now. That, as far as I'm concerned, this is why, the energy to kind of keep banging the same drum about clean cycling. Just in the end, once you've seen a generation of it, the time to act on Vinokurov and Riis, and I'm not saying that Tinkoff have got the same problem, but in terms of their careers, they have the same background. The time to deal with this problem was in 2006, 7, 8. Yeah. Not now. It's too late. Vinokurov is now a legitimate person to run the team. There's no rules in place to say, right, well, you've had all these positive tests, you're now out. So they didn't put those rules in place. Had they done, then we'd have something to debate. As it is, we just have a situation that will just keep going on until the UCI says, actually, we're going to, and it can't be retrospective, because that wouldn't pass the Court of Arbitration for Sport. They have to do it from January the 1st, 2015. If there are 3 positive tests for a team, then the manager, the person registered as the manager, is no longer eligible to run that team. So that's why I do find it hard just to kind of keep going over the same ground. This was why I felt so strongly about it in 2006 and 7, and why I wrote stuff that was probably at the time pretty unpopular. It looked like it was entrenched and dogmatic, but had some of those points been taken on at that time, when cycling's big reputation was really being put through the mangle. Now we've got a situation where it's on a micro level. It gets a couple of lines. It's a development team. It's not the main team, so it doesn't appear. But at a time when we're looking at, where does Velon fit into all of this? How do we look forward? How do these teams monetize? It doesn't help that the team of the Tour de France winner and its feeder team are having all these problems. If you're a big sponsor who wants to spend tens of millions of pounds, euros, dollars on cycling, you're going to look at it and go, well, they can't even organise this properly.
No. And this is where the UCI mustn't be short-sighted. And there has been the feeling in the past, certainly to this point, that they, in their desperation to keep sponsors in the sport, they have perhaps mollycoddled sponsors like Astana, because they simply can't afford to have an organisation ploughing in 30 million euros a year desert the sport. But like you say, Lionel, is that an own goal?
The history of the team is checkered, to say the least, and it's never been dealt with at any point. There's never been, the rules they're not clear enough. There aren't any sanctions that are that are based on dealing with the problem that we've got now. And we should point out as well, we are publicly, at least, in a much better place now, with the problems being development riders who, until they tested positive, the 99% of fans would never have heard of. We're in a much better place, but it's still not helpful at a time when half the teams are trying to get together to prove that the sport can be up there and attract the funding of soccer, Formula 1, tennis, golf and so on.
The Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Subscribe on iTunes, listen on Audioboo, visit us at thecyclingpodcast.com.
So, after all that gloom,
yeah.
Bolto, we're going to turn to you.
A bit ranty.
We're going to turn to you to lighten the mood on this dark December morning. You've just been off on your travels to South Africa. And who have you seen in South Africa?
I did a little jaunt around southern Africa, and a lot of fun it was. I went and visited some Paralympians in Namibia. That's a totally different story. And while I was in Namibia, I also spent a day or two with Dan Craven, Dan from NAM, to see where he actually comes from. And my God, it's far removed from this country. Namibia is a very empty place. And Dan, he rides for Europcar now, rode the Vuelta. He's probably, after 10 years of trying, he's absolutely hit his highest level possible now. But he's got there by when he winters over in Namibia. There are no tarmac roads or virtually none where he lives. So he does all his training on dirt roads on a mountain bike, wearing his Europcar kit in the middle of nowhere. I went mountain biking with him and did all sorts out there. That was for, hopefully a few months down the line, an article for Rouleur magazine, which hopefully will get printed if it's any good. Anyway, main reason for my trip to South Africa was to spend 2 or 3 days filming with Chris Froome for an ITV documentary which will air in February-ish. We haven't got an exact date for it yet. Telling his life, really, telling his sporting life story to this point, and his background. Obviously, it's quite well known now that he grew up in Kenya and had this extraordinary kind of. Extraordinary in the sense that it's very unusual for a middle-class white boy to have spent any time in the townships at all, but he did, and he learned how to ride a bike in the company of David Kinja, the Kenyan international, and then he got removed from Kenya and grew up in really quite salubrious surroundings in Johannesburg and went to one of the top boarding schools in Johannesburg, and then eventually ended up in Europe to do what he's done. What was nice was to spend a bit of time with him and see what he does in the winter in South Africa, how he prepares for the forthcoming season, kind of shape he's in right now. So what are we now? Beginning of December. He's only just started training in it with any kind of seriousness. He spent 6 weeks off a bike, basically, almost entirely, which is really unusual for him. Got married, just him and Michelle. They snuck off and got married on a yacht just off the coast of Cape Town, and it was literally just the two of them. They didn't invite any guests, no friends and family. It was just them and a photographer who they're very unhappy with. Didn't like the quality of his pictures, by the way. There we go. That's the real exclusive. But here's a headline for you. Chris Froome currently, as things stand, as of today, weighs the same as me.
Wow.
Yes.
So he's in good shape then?
He's not in great shape. He's interestingly, he's about 5 or 6 kilos over not where he needs to be, because that's quite normal for him in the winter now. But unlike a lot of other riders, I think probably Mark Cavendish should fit into this category as well. There's no great sense of fret or worry with Chris about losing that extra weight. He reckons he can lose that in 3 weeks.
There is or there isn't fret with Cavendish?
I don't know, you tell me.
Well, I would say that usually there is a great deal of anxiety.
Worries, exactly.
This year perhaps less so, because last night he won the Zurich 6 days. Seems to be in pretty good fettle by all accounts. But also, you knew Froome very well before he won the Tour de France. You've just spent time with him in South Africa. A couple of weeks ago when we were at the Velodrome in Manchester, we spoke to Shane Sutton about Bradley Wiggins never having come to terms with the fact that he won the Tour de France and not really dealing with it, and dealing with the success. How would you analyse that process and how it's gone for Froome, particularly in 2014, and is he coming out of any kind of difficulties that he experienced on that level?
Difficulties. God, he's such a cool customer. He's so ruthless. I mean, he took that in his stride, that 2013 win. In some ways, the 2013 win, I think when he thinks about his racing career now, he's still kind of churning over and obsessing on the 2011 Vuelta, his breakthrough race. And he's still kind of chewing over the cud of 2012. And almost the race in 2013 plays kind of third fiddle to those two. It was just the culmination of everything that he felt had been put in place before that. But he's very single-minded. And, he's oh, by the way, he is going to ride the Tour de France. I mean, that kind of notion that he would somehow not, give it a swerve this year, you absolutely disregard that. He will certainly ride the Tour de France this year. No. He's so far on the other end of the spectrum from Bradley Wiggins that it doesn't bear comparison. He's absolutely thinking now about how he wins this next race, how he compensates for the lack of the long individual time trial, and how he competes on those climbs with Quintana, who I think he thinks is his number one threat on next year's tour.
This documentary, will it air on ITV1 or will it be on ITV4? Do you know that at the moment? I mean, how important would it be for him to be on ITV1 in terms of his profile?
Any revenue sharing more important?
Good question. No, so ITV for the last 2 or 3 years, they started on ITV4. They do get repeated on ITV1, but often kind of late at night. They've done a strand of documentaries that have been, by the way, I think really good, called Sports Life Stories. Crap title really, but they've been excellent documentaries, and they've featured sportsmen like Gareth Thomas, who has a great story to tell, the rugby player, Barry McGuigan, who's got an amazing story to tell, and this new series that's just been commissioned features Chris Froome, Linford Christie, Paula Radcliffe, Carl Froch, one or two others. The unique thing about Chris's story is that we're right in the middle of his career, and most of the Peter Shilton, John Barnes is another one. There you go, Lionel, for you. Almost all of the rest of them have retired and can tell their story with a bit of distance. The interesting thing about doing this one with Chris is that he's right in the middle of it now. So there were delicate sensibilities, which I had to explore, about his relationship with his team, which is not entirely harmonious, I didn't get the impression. And it is interesting that the kind of degree of absolute separation in which the Froome operation kind of exists from. I know he lives in Monaco, and I know he trains with Richie, and they're very close, Richie Port and Geraint Thomas to a certain extent there. But he does winter in southern Africa, and it does feel when you're out there with him and he's training on his own as he loves to in the Suikerbosrand, this range of mountains outside Johannesburg. You do feel like you have to kind of pinch yourself and remind yourself, oh yeah, you're part of this Team Sky thing, aren't you? Because he does seem to be, doing it on his own, and sure there'll be an email exchange with Tim Kerrison looking after his training program, and he'll be reporting back, but it feels a million miles away. And it does feel like the Chris Froome who did it his own way, became a mountain, a climber, a GC rider early on in South Africa by where there are no climbs of sufficient length, by going up what mountains there were with his brakes applied, just so he could replicate the effort of a longer form alpine climb. These homespun training methods, this sense of doing it on your own, and all the eccentricities that you associate with Chris Froome's development still apply to a certain extent. He does feel out on a limb back there. When you do come back and see him in this sort of in the setting of the Team Sky set pieces, I don't think that's really gone away. Yes, he does occupy centre stage, and yes, Bradley Wiggins is a marginalised figure now, but Chris Froome still is not. He is a kind of square peg in a round hole still now.
It almost sounds like a bit of the Cadell Evanses about him, the way elements of his story. I mean, one thing I was going to ask you, Bolto, you talked about his ruthlessness. Now, the impression from the outside, and perhaps at last year's Tour 2013, when we had those very gnarly first few days with the cobbles and rain, and there was a sense that perhaps he was going into those stages a little bit tentative. And then when this year there were noises to the effect that he might miss the Tour de France, again, a course where there were a lot of kind of pitfalls in that first week, a lot of terrain that isn't particularly favourable to him, that again perhaps it was a little bit of fear of what we said about Shane Sutton said about Bradley Wiggins living up to that precedent that he'd set for himself, the fear of disappointing people, and just a level of kind of tentativeness. You don't think that applies?
I think it probably did. I think you're right to think that the impression he made on me back in Yorkshire on the Grand Départ was of a man who was slightly unsure of himself, and I think he did carry an enormous pressure going into that race. The horrible word that doesn't really apply in cycling, but defending champion was kind of aired. It's a nonsense really, but there was a degree to which he was finding that hard to deal with. Obviously he wouldn't have wanted to crash on stage 4 and then abandon on stage 5, but that's what happened to him. And now his story, both in terms of how we present his story in the media and how he narrates it to himself, I think, and psychologically within his own sort of game plan, I think it becomes an easier story to tell. And I think now, because he didn't win the Tour last year, I think he can attack it with a degree of freedom that he didn't have last year, where he must have felt desperately hamstrung by the whole situation, and there was that tension with which he approached the race. I think he can take the shackles off now and express himself, particularly because he's already, if you like, with his kind of objection to the Tour route this year, he's kind of laid down. got his excuses in early. That's overstating it, but he has given himself a bit of kind of wriggle room there to say, right, this ain't for me, but I'll just have to give it a damn good go, won't I?
Yeah, I think there's an element of all of that kind of little mini mind games, and not necessarily with your opponents, but with yourself. You're quite right. The term defending champion doesn't really work in the Tour de France, but I think mentally they go in with more pressure on their shoulders, more to lose. They can only not win it again. You know, Dave Brailsford made that point in Yorkshire in the press conference that the goal is to win the Tour again rather than defend something that they've already won. Yeah. But when you are the defending champion, every single thing you do is analysed and processed and reacted to in that context, as you are the man that was wearing the yellow jersey a year ago, and that must just creep up on you to the point where it feels like you've got your head in a vice a bit coming into the Tour. He will be completely without that this year, and in a way, you know, can sort of move in the shadows a bit more and not necessarily have to show himself early on. And I think Daniel's point is very true. He's almost sort of convinced himself that the Tour route doesn't suit him because there isn't a long time trial, yet he is one of the most explosive climbers there is, and one of the few people that can genuinely put fear into the heart of Quintana and Contador.
What an intriguing sort of collection of different mindsets between those four, Contador, Quintana, Nibali and Froome. I mean, we sort of think about the tenacity of Contador and Froome as well, the way you're presenting it, Ned, and Quintana, people that know him well describe him as being almost Merckx-like, you know, his kind of voracious appetite for racing and winning. And then Nibali, who's perhaps slightly different, who has this kind of sense of flow and this kind of ease, this kind of carefree nature to the way he approaches racing and life in general. So that is another element to the sort of four-way battle we're going to see next year at the Tour.
Yeah, I think the other thing, just in terms of the language we use talking about cycling, a very good point you made about the nonsense of the defending champion, but also when we watch a mountain stage, if Chris Froome loses the wheel for 40 metres, 50 metres and then rides back up, we see that as or we are tempted to see that as a moment of weakness. And I think from our interview with Shane Sutton about Bradley Wiggins, when Bradley Wiggins would let gaps go and close up, it's not necessarily what we see on the screen that gives us a sense of whether they're strong or weak. The only thing that really matters is where they cross the line in relation to one another, and I think that's one of as the sort of storytelling of the Tour de France evolves in the British media, you know, that's one of the things that I find quite fascinating, is that we see these moments where we think, he's under pressure here. We're not entirely sure. We can never be entirely sure whether that's not all under control and everything's okay. And so I think that's where it could be fascinating. We see these four different athletes, but four different mentalities all going up against each other. And
make no mistake, you know, for all that Team Sky suffer from this reputation of riding by numbers, and there is an element to which, you know, you could level that accusation at Chris Froome. There is a racing animal inside Chris, that he is perfectly prepared on the final climb of the day to bluff. In fact, he relishes it. You know, bluffing is one of his favourite weapons. He's done it repeatedly. He did it on La Toussuire just before he attacked Wiggins. In 2012, he dropped back, bluffed alongside Cadel Evans that he was in terrible trouble, then looked alongside him to see that Evans was actually suffering genuinely, and then attacked Evans, and that was the end of Evans' defence of his tour, if you like. He does it a lot, and he sniffs out psychological weakness. He's absolutely aware. I mean, some riders will say, and maybe Nibali's like this, I don't know, some riders will say that they just ride their own race and they're lost inside, and I think Bradley Wiggins is a rider who just gets lost inside his own world when he rides. Chris Froome is entirely receptive to everything that's going on around him, and his eyes are out on stalks and his ears are, you know, tuned to the noises around him in the bunch, and he works with it. He uses it as a tool. I think he's an incredibly alert rider, and he has this reputation of kind of innocence and naivety, and you know, I think he's tactically bang on a lot of the time, and he has this capacity, as you say, to come back from the dead and to go again just at the point where 99% of the riders would just crack and disappear. Froome can find something else within him. You know, his first ever stage win as a professional, his first ever win as a pro was in the 2011 Vuelta, of all places to win, and Peña Quebaga, you know, when Cobo came past him, and then Froome actually went again. And how often do you see that on How often do you ever see that actually on a mountaintop finish? Once you're past, the rule is that's it, you're dead. But Froome, if you can rediscover that the 2011 Chris Froome, the 2012 Chris Froome, if you like, and 13, and take it into next year's tour, you can't say he's not going to win it.
Well, Ned, of course, Team Sky are part of the Velon organisation. Tinkoff Saxo are part of the Velon organisation, so they're going to boycott the tour. We already know that.
Yeah.
Astana will have lost their World Tour licence, so it's going to be Nairo Quintana versus Domenico Pozzovivo and others. So we look forward to that. But it's been a delight and an honour having you here, Ned. I'm sure we'll be seeing you again very shortly. Lionel, it's been sort of standard fare. We see you every week.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Ned.
Cheers.
Just time to let you know about a live event we're doing in a couple of weeks' time. The Cycling Podcast Live will be held at the Velo House in Tunbridge Wells in Kent on December the 17th in the evening. Richard, Daniel and myself will be there discussing the whole cycling season and taking questions from the floor. Tickets are £12 and the website you need to check out all the details is www.thevelohouse.com. Hopefully see you there.